Hi, I'm the real reason Hasbro keeps making clone repaints. Andrew, and this is Gayties Toys. On today's MIA 80s Ladies, we're going on a bit of a journey. So if you're new here, this is a series where I talk about, women from 80s franchises, in both directions, who never got action figures. And sometimes I get requests of, real niche things, real obscure properties. And this is certainly one of those cases, and certainly one of those ones where I've come to sort of appreciate these. I kind of enjoy doing these deep dives because I know practically nothing about them. So with all that said, let's just get right into Shadow Strikers, Ariel, Stewart, and someone else. Shadow Strikers was a toy line made by Kenner in 1990. The essential setup of it was Lance Heston created a material called transparium, where it was stronger than steel and also was, being able to be transparent or invisible. Essentially, an evil doctor named Dr. Viper stole this, formula, gave it to his little crew called the Evaders, and a little, war broke out when the Shadow Strikers were formed in response to the Evaders. Because of said transparium, the toy pattern, the notion was that the cars, tanks, planes, even the characters themselves, the action figures, would turn invisible. Uh, that said, I mean, it didn't really, translate that well. You could certainly see the inner workings, and not to belabor the point, but I mean, if you have eyes, you see the problem here. That said, you can see sort of where the inspiration came from. I mean, if it's the early 90s, between your Crystal Pepsi, between your Walkmans, between your backpacks, between your phones, which was one of the things that I had, it's 1990 and your favorite color is clear. It's also worth noting, and there's no real evidence of this that I could find at the very least, and that's really sort of, a major problem with this franchise as a whole, is that there's not a lot of information out there on it. But a lot of fans speculate, and I think correctly, that this was sort of a bit of, if not a spin-off, then a spiritual successor to Kenner's much more popular Mask line. A lot of people will say, their parts were used, but I would sort of more argue that a lot of these pieces may or may not have been, parts of Mask's 1989 line that never actually happened. Shadow Strikers, of course, came out in 1990, so there's, certainly some, precedents that, Mask was certainly, an inspiration for this. If you are a child of the 80s or 90s, you also know that the launch of a toy line isn't just a singular event. It comes with a whole marketing juggernaut of other ancillary media, and that would include, say, coloring books, cake pans, tents, home pregnancy tests, you name it. Everything goes along to support the toy line, to get it out in the market and sort of become a brand name. In this case, I can't find anything, and my initial thoughts were that perhaps it's very rare. This was a very blink and you miss it kind of toy line. A lot of people don't even know about it. So it's possible that there were coloring books, Valentine's Day cards, anything of the sort, but I can't find it. So there is the potential that it's just increasingly rare. More likely, I think, is that Kenner themselves didn't really have much faith in this from the jump. And that really sort of goes, into our next conversation, the cartoon. More often than not, particularly in the 80s and 90s, the cartoon supported the toy line supported the cartoon. In this case, the only real media of sorts that came out for Shadow Strikers was a VHS tape of a single pilot episode that was sort of included in the general rollout of the toy line. That was it. And I think maybe, the thought was, had this exploded, had this really gone off, they could have gone and done more, but as it stands, it's just one single episode. It's from this cartoon that we get sort of the two characters in question that, if you've been paying attention to the series, very obviously it did not get action figure lines in the original run. Of the two characters, one is real frustrating. So we're going to start with the easier one, and that would be Ariel Stewart. In this singular pilot episode, once the Shadow Strikers are all, gathered together, they are introduced to their communication specialist, Ariel Stewart, in a very kind of clunky dialogue sort of manner. She's very much kind of a trope amongst characters at this time in particular, where you would have sort of the woman back at the home base, or the eyes in the sky, or the person who would, deposit exposition or send out, the mission kind of thing, the materials. Very much a kind of a backseater character who would only occasionally get involved in the action, and very much so. I mean, she really went through the whole gauntlet of that, where she sort of sent out the mission briefing, and then at the very end was at least sort of somewhat instrumental in defending the base in the final battle of the episode. That said, I mean, there's not much else to say about her. She had no romantic links to other characters. She had no real kind of fiery spunk to speak of. There were other characters, much like, say, Janine Melnitz or Crystal Kane from, say, Centurions, who would be much more memorable tropes of this kind. She, of course, never got an action figure, and that's not terribly surprising. This was Kenner, who was very much not afraid of girls, but also Kenner, now owned by Hasbro, who very much had a unofficial but kind of official no girls allowed policy during the stretch of time leading up to 1992, 1993. So, Kenner was probably very much encouraged not to do so. That said, she's also one of those characters I think was, sort of created by pressure from broadcasters for cartoons to include female characters to appeal to girls. So she really much fits into that old trope as well. That said, I mean, had this, woulda, coulda, shoulda toy line really succeeded, it's conceivable that had they done, the base for the Shadow Strikers, that she would have slotted into that, little box set, play set quite nicely. That said, that was never going to happen. The other character, the femme fatale of the Evaders, that's a different story. So here's the thing. When I decide to make one of these videos, the very first thing I do is create a little folder in my wider Gayties Toys folder with the names of the characters I'm going to talk about. With my initial research, I found, I couldn't even find pictures of these characters. It was very, I had to really kind of dig deep for this. So I had to go and watch the episode just to sort of get an idea of who these characters were. At the very least, Ariel Stewart was sort of, her name was said very clunkily, much like all the other characters. But I watched the whole thing front to back, could not find the name of the main villainess, and I watched it again, and I watched it many more times than I care to, and it's conceivable that I'm hard of hearing, it's conceivable that I missed it, but I watched it a lot. Like, let me just make this very clear. So much so that I just got so frustrated that I almost just put henchwoman in the title card, in the file name, because I just could not find out what her name was, despite the fact that everyone else got glorious declarations of what their names and basically what their duties and vehicles did as well. To not have a name is a disrespect I've not actually encountered before in this entire series. So it really sort of stuck in my craw a little bit. And it's sort of, you might think, well, she might not be that much, very important to the plot, to the franchise, to the, what have you. You have to bear in mind that the main villain of the franchise in this cartoon was Dr. Viper. However, he was undercover with the Shadow Strikers during the entire episode, up until maybe the last 5 minutes sort of thing. So really, his proxy was this villainous character. She was the one who took his orders, relayed them to the Evaders, pretty much led the charge in battles, plural, using Dr. Viper's vehicle. She was very instrumental, and in fact, probably, arguably, the chief villainess of that VHS tape. So it's not that she's a throwaway character or someone that didn't matter to the plot, quite the opposite, but didn't have a name. As the time came forward for me to do this video, I got more and more frustrated. So I did sort of a bit of a blanket, Hail Mary, and I emailed some people who worked on the show. Luckily, John Kafka, the director of this episode, did get back to me, and he sort of, unsurprisingly said, wow, I hadn't really thought of that show for a long, long time. That said, he did sort of finally unveil that the name of this character was the Countess, and if you do watch the episode, you can sort of maybe suspect why. The only woman amongst the voice cast was the late, great Linda Gary, probably most well known from He-Man. And so she, along with Alan Oppenheimer, who is of course famous for playing Skeletor, were both the chief villains of this episode. So it was great to see a Skeletor Evelyn reunion, but very much a Skeletor Evelyn reunion. They were certainly playing these characters. That was exactly Skeletor's voice. That was exactly Evelyn's voice. The difference being, this Evelyn had a vaguely Eastern European accent. So the Countess was a little bit of Evelyn and a little bit Baroness. We never really got a backstory to her, but you know, the homage, let's say, if not the ripoff, is pretty obvious. Like Ariel Stewart, like so many ladies of this very specific time period, she of course never got an action figure. And the fact that she flew the boss's plane really kind of hammers that home, that she wasn't really planned. So it's one of those things where, you know, if you're a super fan of Shadow Strikers, you know, welcome. Good to see you. I've never met any of you. I do wish you had gotten your entire cast, up to including, you know, the military general, like all the other characters from that episode. But here's the thing. I mean, they were never had, you know, Kenner didn't have a lot of faith in this. Very clearly, they sort of like plopped it out. May or may not have used mask parts just to get something onto the market to, you know, capitalize on the clear plastic trend. But, you know, these two were never meant to be. And speaking of never going to be. So this final verdict should be pretty quick. To date, currently, time of our Lord, 2026. The only, you know, use of the name Shadow Strikers by Hasbro specifically is for a Decepticon lesbian transformer named Shadow Striker, which, awesome. So, you know, at the very least, they keep the copyright or the trademark or whatever, you know, is involved in the naming conventions of, you know, holding on to these things. But I cannot fathom Hasbro, in particular, having anything to do with Shadow Strikers in the future. That said, I've long said that Hasbro is really more functioning like a real estate property management at the moment. They lease out their properties to other companies to take the risk, to, you know, spend the money, make the product. You see this very much with Super 7, with the Loyal Subjects. And speaking of the Loyal Subjects, they, of course, are doing Mask currently. They are very young in that line. It is very, seemingly, quite popular. We'll see how deep that goes. I can't imagine they will recreate every single vehicle from the original line. But, you know, let's say they do, and they sort of get to the end of that line, and they say, you know, what else we got? The consumers are still hungry. It's conceivable, however unlikely, that they could do, let's say, an homage, or, you know, sort of sneak in little Easter eggs of Shadow Strikers, given, at the very least, the fans' perspective of the link between the two. All that said, between the Countess and Ariel Stewart, cannot imagine they are top priority to be made in that sub line. So, as it stands, if you're a fan, God help you, I don't think you're ever going to see these characters. And frankly, I mean, there's a lot of characters on this list that I'm a ride or die, but I'm not going to lose sleep over these two. And on that dour note, that's about it for Shadow Strikers. There's not a lot to say. There's not a lot of research out there. It is a very difficult thing to sort of get your head around because there's not a lot out there. So you do have to sort of scour through animation cells, trademarks, all this kind of thing. So if you're a fan, they're out there. There's a, you know, and the problem being is that the toys themselves, you know, being clear, being a 35-year-old plastic, do degrade. So you're going to get a lot of yellow. A lot of yellow Shadow Strikers. So, interesting line, strange concept, given that they're not really invisible, but I digress. And with all that said, I thank you for watching, thank you for liking, subscribing, all those YouTube things, and I will see you next time on MIA 80s Ladies.